Christine Gorman and Bill asked me to remind folks to say your name and affiliation, so I cover global health from New York. For Cynthia, two quick questions. One, how do you, for folks who access their news through RSS feeds, how do you monetize that part of it? Because they don't necessarily go to the site.
That's a really good question. Surprisingly, you're one of the few that uses RSS feeds. This technology's been around a while. Everyone talks about it. But when you look at the penetration, it hasn't gone up in several years. It's really kind of surprising because you think, oh, this is so cool. It's one of those things, one of those technologies. You're just sure it's really going to make it. And then I just think it's surprisingly not as popular. However, of course, advertising has the same problem with RSS feeds, right? But I don't really think it's an issue for great content and service sites, especially for service sites, but even content sites, because all the real fun happens on the site. That's where you're interacting with the other users of that site, where you're making comments, where you're looking at all kinds of interactivity. Those things are, to me, just tidbits, and if you've got great content and people are really interacting with your site, they're going to be going there anyway. And again, for Kachingle, which is a voluntary contribution system, and we're not like like any kind of charitable contribution, but it is still true that you don't need everybody to contribute to make real serious money. You just need kind of your avid users to do that. So I think over time we will evolve a solution to handle RSS feeds if they become more widespread than they are now. But it's like I say, still the main thing is that the real fun is going on the actual sites. And the second question?
And the second question actually is kind of a follow-up to what you just said. How do you deal with the loafers or the slackers or the people who take advantage, kind of the tragedy of the commons?
The people that take advantage of you without that aren't going to pay or what?
Right.
Well, look at the music business, and you see that there's really no way around that. There's going to be people that don't pay. That's the internet. But there are going to be enough people, we believe, and we've done, our calculations, that show that for great content, that people really do want to support it. And remember, they're not just supporting it. They're getting something back. They're getting this recognition that they are part of that site, that they are associated with that site, that they get to be part of their persona, that their Facebook persona, that they are associated with that site. And those are the people that are going to make the contributions. And the people that are kind of flitting in and out, that's good. Let them tweet the articles and let them bring in more people. You can kind of have the best of both worlds.
The first part was about RSS feeds, and maybe you could integrate this into your solution. But what we do is we allow for image tags within RSS feeds to hit our server and then hit back with whatever image there was. So actually, people in blog readers and RSS readers actually get credit for it. And the second part is the free part. And I think that encouraging free access is absolutely essential. Having a world where we must pay for something is not going to work. So the way that we solved this was we set aside 10% of people's revenue that they pay us each month to a free pool. And the free pool is just based on the actually whole aggregate internet distribution for a given site. So if your site is 1% of the internet, you get 1% of the free pool.
I just want to tell you that I'm thrilled to be here because these are the kinds of conversations that are going to help us figure out what we're going to do. I like so many of the models that I've heard, and one of the things Paychecker is trying to do is to offer all the different possible models. We had a slide that said, many models, no clear winner. Why not offer that to the user? In other words, to make it a simple interface where I come to a site, I see a medallion or a button or something like a PayPal button, and that lets me then see all of the different potential models and let the publishers choose which of the different payment forms they would like and offer those out to the users, and then the users can basically look at a menu of those and say, well, I like the Kachingle model, or I like the, Once in a Moon, is that the name?
In a Moon.
In a Moon, and, or I like, this model or that model or the other, because really, I'm not sure we're going to be able to figure out exactly what the ultimate solution should be or what every possible solution could be. But if we turn it and use the internet and offer it out to the user, and get the user's input, that may provide, the best solution. What do people think about that?
Well, let me just say your point in general is a really great one. There should be no one right answer to this. I use Kachingle. I've used a variety of things. I think for some people and some sites, different models will work differently. What works for the Wall Street Journal is not going to work for my daughter's blog. And so the great thing about the internet is it will have hundreds of models, just as in the real world we have dozens of models. I mean, for how you can pay when you go to Starbucks or something. So we should celebrate the diversity of choices we will have, both for the content provider who says, I want to do it in these 4 different ways or keep it totally free or whatever, and for the user. This is the way I prefer to get it. And that includes things we haven't even discussed or thought of, such as bundling, or, your aggregation site comes close to that, but licensing and bundling and finding ways that people can be part of clubs that, whatever it may be, the experimentation will be really cool to watch over the next 5 years.
I have to react to that, though, by making it really clear that our point of view, and I'm sure it's a shared point of view by most people, is that simple is better than complicated, by far, especially in the context of the revolution we're all championing up here. So the notion that the consumer is going to come and have too many choices, probably, at least in the early stages of this metamorphosis, is a bad idea. And that one choice, followed by the iteration of it that follows, and so on and so forth, probably is going to get this thing moving more quickly than presenting multiple choices from day one.
I just got to agree with Meryl. No thinking. You can't ask users to think about this. Too many choices. The hardest thing for Kachingle is we had 500 features that seemed, so fantastic, right? We're down to like 15. And as far as a user signing up, email address, password, display name, and PayPal account information, which is their email address. And they can't even decide how much money they want to contribute initially. Of course, over time, we're going to give them social signals, but you cannot make it complicated. No mental transaction costs, no thinking. It's got to be so simple. People are flitting from, just look in your browser. You'll be shocked. You're going to hundreds of sites a day. Who wants to be deciding at each site this kind of anything? You just want to, right?
And I did mention one part of what we consider core to our challenge, and that is the marketing public affairs component of this. There is a re-education of the global content consumer that has to take place here, and it has to be done in a thoughtful way, making some of the arguments we've made up here today. But the notion that there's anything like a switch or even a dimmer that's suddenly going to make this happen is simplistic.
There's a generation of people, perhaps 2 generations of people, who I'm not sure appreciate that Milton Friedman's column is worth paying for versus somebody else's information.
Well, Milton Friedman's is not worth paying for. So.
Sorry?
Maybe Tom.
The point is that I think that there's an enormous number of young people, and we've got a room full of journalists here who love this stuff, but there's an awful lot of people who wouldn't give you 10 cents for this because they don't appreciate all the work that's gone into it, the value of it, the fact that it's been vetted and edited and all that other stuff. And unless we can create demand for information among that generation, they're not going to pay for it. They'll take whatever they can get and watch American Idol at night.
I just don't think that's true because a lot of them are bloggers and they think their stuff is worth something. They know it's hard to create great content. I think it's going to be like the difference between, before blogging came along and, people, if you wanted to do anything, you had to create a website and it was like really hard. And, who would have believed that if you just made it really, really easy, that like everybody had something to say? I think there's a big ease of use issue here. When Radiohead came out with their album, in Rainbows, and they allowed people to make contributions, they got contributions from this very same crowd. So, we'll see. But I think if you make it super easy and you give them something back, like in Silicon Valley, everyone reads the Freakonomics blog. It's kind of like de rigueur, you got to do it, and you want that to be part of your, even for these younger entrepreneurs, you want that to be part of your profile.
Couple of reactions. Number one, let's not confuse what we're seeing in news consumption habits today as suggesting that today's generation is less interested than previous ones. They are, and although that is kind of in the wind about young people in the news, there isn't a single shred of data that suggests that they are less interested at age 20 or 25 than we were. So they care about it, they're interested, and they're purchasers of content in multiple forms. My prism is through my kids, as lots of our prisms are through our own families. My kids buy books, they buy magazines, and of course they buy music in significant amounts. The notion of paying for content in their daily lives is not outside the mainstream of their thinking. We obviously have a reinvention to do about web content to get them to appreciate its value and the price points that come with it.
How much money as a profit margin do we have to make? Because we're talking about paid content options. How much money as a profit margin do we have to generate? Because we're coming out of a business that generates 20 to 30% traditionally. What profit margin are you looking for?
I don't really know how to answer that question, frankly. I mean, obviously, the public markets have an expectation about profit margin that supports PE ratios and stock prices and so forth, and I don't know that formula is ever going to change. Venture capital guys want 10 times the return on their investment, and Mr. Karp here is under enormous pressure to do so in that regard. So, I mean, it depends what business you're in.
Well, we have a business that has an expectation of double-digit profits. A lot of these businesses that are so troubled right now are actually still profitable. They're just not making the profit, so they're cutting their costs. Not because they're losing money, but because they're not making the money they expected to make.
Or they have large debt burdens.
Because they were unwise. But the question is then, we're talking about sustaining and paying for the creativity. How much, with these big organizations, how much do you have to give them to get there?
Well, I'll make a comment. Of course, I'm new to the journalism business. This is like my 6th journalism conference in 6 months, and everything I learned about journalism I've learned in the last 6 months. So if there's stuff I don't know, which is a lot, that you think I should know, please come up and tell me. Because I come from high tech, so I got a lot to learn. But when I look at the news business, and we're for all content and services. I mean, for instance, we've been contacted by many of the big media organizations, along with like a site that has 500,000 unique visitors a month. Is a word game site, so it can be anything, cable TV, whatever. But when I look at the kind of site that I think Kachingle, along with advertising, can really support, it's something like the Min Post, where they, it's all online, it's very pared down. I think that may be the future of great journalism. And there's other sites like Melinda's site, there's Melinda, that here in Washington, D.C., that I think are also part of that model. Just because you got to get those costs down, so what you're really supporting is the journalism and the editors. That's my kind of, I would say, naive view, perhaps, of the future of news.
Well, if you look, let me jump in a quick answer to that. If you look at Google's business, they are newspaper-like profitable, right? And what their cost structure is they have to pay for the development and maintenance of all these algorithms that do all the work. But if we're actually human beings doing the work and driving the value for the content creation, I mean, there could be a business that looks like that, but the costs are actually human capital, creative people who are driving all the different value elements and can be paid out of the same kind of a profitable business. I think it's also a question of scale, because one site only has limited scale, and its economics are going to be extremely different. I mean, I have a blog which has more subscribers than a lot of small newspapers, but it's on the web that scale doesn't translate into the kind of profits that it would if it were a 50,000 circulation newspaper.
In sequential order, I would like you to ask your questions and then take it to the panel, and then you can field whichever question you heard that most interested you. I think that'll speed it up a little bit. So, Melissa, go ahead.
I am with a group called Making Sense, Pointer Institute. I also have a website. I'm a journalist, television journalist. My question is about rights having to do with, well, I heard a speech by Jim Kennedy, and also regarding music rights. So you're talking about a book, you're talking digitally, and we're talking about rights. How do I put an article from the Associated Press from my community to read on my site and worry about, whether I have to pay you or not? And it's something that's substantive that they need to look at. And how do you deal with music rights when you're talking about writing a book digitally?
Capture that question, Mark.
I'm Mark Contreras from Scripps Newspapers in Cincinnati. My question is, we've talked a lot about getting money from consumers. Do you all see a B2B relationship or a B2B structure within the print industry or other industries that could deliver value to the creators of the content but avoid getting payments directly from consumers?
I'm Victor Bicard with Free Press. Very quick question. It sounds like for a lot of these models to work, the newspaper industry-wide, would have to agree on prices and various standards. And for this to happen, do you think antitrust exemptions would be necessary?
I'm Jane Rosenberg from City University of New York, and my question, it really kind of follows that last question. Just wondering, for those of you, I think it's Merrill and for Scott, who seem to be suggesting a subscriber-based model or paywalls. How do you kind of get around what Cynthia had said about paywalls being, I think it was the kiss of death, and eliminating the possibility of going viral? How do you, why do you think that would work?
Okay, that should be enough. So we have, what do we think about digital rights and rights to content? Are there B2B opportunities at hand? Are there antitrust issues if we decide we're going to a sort of monolithic paywall concept? And do we think paywalls really are the right solution? And do we have an answer for them yet?
I'm going to do a speed round, three in quick succession. One, just to clarify, the publish-to model is completely agnostic to paywalls. It's more about creating a new package. Whether you monetize that through advertising or through payment is sort of agnostic to that. To Mark's question about B2B relationship, I mean, I think everybody's looking to Google for sort of a B2B kind of relationship, which Google can't support. But I think if you had an entity that through the combined effort of the different news organizations were generating significant revenue, then that was the front end to the consumer. Then the news organization can basically collaborate through that entity to generate revenue. And on the antitrust question, I'm sorry.
Did you want antitrust?
Oh yeah, antitrust. I guess the only thing I say is that it's Google. Google is sort of the antitrust whipping boy right now, and say what can counterbalance Google. So it's potentially a good environment for that conversation. I won't suggest what the outcome ought to be, but just to observe that.
All right, I'll take the rights question because I think it's really interesting. I think that as we create a solution, we actually have to do something that embraces distribution and doesn't veer away from it. So I would imagine that each content producer puts their own ID onto a page, and as it gets viewed, it gets counted. So right now in newspapers, we have photographers, editors, publishers, distributors, and each one of those could individually earn revenue from a view by a user. So by doing that, you can actually embed that content into your own blog, so that we're actually encouraging people to distribute, to work with the way the internet works, and not against it.
In terms of both industry pricing and antitrust, our project is about empowering publishers to set their own prices. So we might have views about it. We're going to collect data about what's working and what's not working, but the Boston Globe will have one view of what to do with some content category, and a small newspaper in Nebraska will have a different one, and a blogger will have yet a different one. So we're setting no pricing policies at all other than empowering publishers to do so, and that addresses the same question of this phrase paywall. We're not about paywalls. We're about a subscription product and platform that allows publishers to recognize revenue rather than thinking of putting their entire products behind some so-called wall.
So let's see, the antitrust. Well, for Kachingo, it's the user that's essentially setting the price, of course, without any thinking. So it doesn't really apply. In fact, we're more like AdSense for the producer, which you just, you go to Kachingle, you get the medallion, takes a few minutes, you upload it, and you're done. So it just doesn't compute for us. The B2B, we actually have plans for ways that companies can become Kachinglers and be supporting sites and give them a really powerful way to reach the people that are the most interested in that kind of content, which would translate into some kind of product interest. And as far as the what would you call it? The thing that you were talking about, huh?
The rates?
Pardon me?
Rates?
Well, the way you would distributed content. This is a really interesting issue, and he touched on it somewhat, which is, we're looking at things like maybe tapping into a Creative Commons license so that when you come to a page that it does have a lot of embedded content, that everyone would get their fair share. And I think that is something that can be relatively easily evolved and would be fair to all of the content providers.
Yeah, I agree with that on the digital rights management, which is the most important issue here, in my opinion, which is when you aggregate, pull things together, how does everybody get a fair share? This is something that's happened ever since Ben Franklin was doing it back in colonial days. Certainly if I produce a magazine, or for that matter, a Kindle reader that has a picture in it and a piece of music in it and whatever, each of those probably in the ideal world would be compensated proportionally and fairly. We have had ASCAP systems for licensing of music, so AM radios can do ASCAP. We have invented over the years quite a few systems where every time a particular song gets played on the radio, or every time a picture from Corbis Pictures is used in Time magazine, it is pretty darn simple. When I was editor of Time, I could put in pictures without having to figure out how to do the rights management because there's a system for it. So eventually we will evolve these systems in the digital age where rights management is compensated. I do think when you, on my own personal view on the antitrust issue is I'm not in favor of changing the antitrust laws. I'd like everybody to compete and just try to, if somebody says my content, I'll put it up for free. If the Daily News says I'll put it up for free and the New York Post says I'll charge for it, I'd rather be in that world where that competition happens than allow them to collude. But newspaper owners would disagree with me on that, but I just am in favor of competition. And for people saying my free model works better for me and I'm going to win the competition by doing that. As opposed to a very small technical thing on paywalls, I agree that most of your stuff shouldn't be behind a paywall because you're not going to be part of the conversation. But Google and other search engines can get to you behind a paywall if you want. If you talk to Marissa Mayer and others who developed the search for Google, anybody who wants to can be searched behind a paywall. We will have to find ways, because I do think paywalls are a huge impediment to the sharing of information, which is why I think it gets back to finding more sophisticated ways to compensate digital rights owners for their content. This is something that ain't new. When Ted Nelson invented, and others, hypertext 30, 40 years ago, and when it first said, hypertext did have this concept, all HTTP protocols, that it could accrue it could sort of be a metering system that would accrue which intellectual property was used and eventually allow compensation for that intellectual property. We're at the very, very beginning of this discussion, and even though newspapers are dying and there's a need to hurry up the discussion, I think it's just going to have to sort itself out.